This video is sponsored by the Ultimate Freelancing Bundle by StudyWebDevelopment.com, which gives you everything you need to start your own freelancing business, including a 130-page in-depth guide, invoicing and client proposal templates, website templates, an SEO checklist, and much more. Visit the link in the description and use the code BRAD25 to get 25% off. Hey, what's going on, guys? So I get a lot of questions from a lot of people, and one of the most popular ones is, when am I ready to learn a front-end framework? I've learned HTML, CSS, some JavaScript. What do I need to know to start to learn React or Vue or Angular? And that's what this guide is about. It's the skills that I personally recommend learning before you jump into a framework, and I'm going to stick with the top three, which are React, Angular, and Vue. They're all different, but certain things are used in every single one of these frameworks, and if you learn this stuff beforehand, you'll have much less trouble grasping the concepts of the particular framework. Not only that, but you'll be able to pick up multiple frameworks very easily because you already know these core concepts, these JavaScript concepts. Now, instead of just saying, learn ES6, I'm going to go through each suggestion, and after I go through them all, I'm going to show you different examples of these things within all three frameworks. So you can see that a lot of this stuff, it's just global to JavaScript rather than a particular framework. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, obviously, this is a no-brainer. You want to learn the basics and fundamentals of JavaScript before moving to a framework. I think most people know this. This includes basic syntax, variables, arrays, objects, functions, loops, all the stuff that you would learn when you're starting to learn a language. I didn't put DOM manipulation here because with most frameworks you don't directly touch the DOM. However, I'd still recommend learning that stuff, especially if you want to, if you ever want to build something in vanilla JavaScript. Now, one problem I've seen is that people want to jump right into a framework after just this, after learning the fundamentals. And I think that's a big mistake because not only are they attempting to learn the concepts of the framework, but they're also learning all of ES6 at the same time, things like classes, arrow functions, destructuring. And the problem is that they won't be able to identify what's actually part of the framework and then what's actual JavaScript. So I think that's one of the biggest mistakes that people make. So this is necessary right here, all this stuff, but it's not the ending point of learning just regular JavaScript and moving to a framework. So next we have modules, and modules are used in every framework because they're used to import files into other files or import packages. And without modules, there wouldn't be any framework because modules allow everything to work together. And instead of having isolated code and files. And there's different types of modules, but you want to focus on ES6 modules or ES 2015 modules, same thing, which is the import from syntax. Now, Angular actually uses TypeScript, which has many of the same features that ES6 has, including modules. So if you learn ES6 modules, you'll be fine with TypeScript. Now, modules are not supported in browsers directly, so you do have to use some kind of tooling like Parcel or Webpack with Babel if you want to be able to compile modules. Now, I'm not going to say that you have to learn how to do that before moving to a framework, like learn how to configure Webpack and all that stuff. But I would suggest at least reading about modules a little bit, looking at the syntax, maybe watching a tutorial before you move on to learning a framework. All right, so next we have classes. So classes were introduced in ES6 or ES 2015. I call it ES6. I know you're supposed to call it ES 2015. But classes are used in many languages, and you may even be familiar with classes from another language. And classes are more commonly used in React and Angular. Vue kind of uses like an object literal type style. But even if you're learning Vue, I would suggest learning classes. Learn how to structure them, learn about constructors, methods and properties, instantiation, which means creating objects from the class, as well as extending classes and inheritance. All right, so next is arrow functions. Arrow functions will make your code much more compact and clean, even though there's many situations where you don't need to use arrow functions. In my experience, they're kind of the norm when it comes to building stuff with these frameworks. It's cleaner, it's less lines of code, and there can also be advantages within scope. It uses something called a lexical this. So you want to look into that stuff before learning a framework. All right, so next thing is promises. ES6 introduced promises as an alternative to using callbacks for asynchronous code. So if we make a request to a server or anything that could take a while, we want to do it asynchronously so that we can move on with our application and not have to stop and wait for a response. So promises do just that. They make a promise and then fulfill it when the task is done. And you should learn how to create and receive promises. When a promise completes, you want to use .then to catch the response and get the data back, and then .catch to catch any possible errors. Now, there's also the async await syntax, which I believe was introduced in ES7, which can handle promises in more of a synchronous fashion. That may be something you want to look into, but I don't think it's absolutely necessary to be able to use a framework. And some people rather just use the standard syntax anyways without using async await. Okay, you're also going to want to learn how to use the fetch API to make HTTP requests. This is built into JavaScript. There's other tools like Axios that you can use, but it's good to know how to do this with vanilla JavaScript. So next thing is destructuring. Destructuring allows you to unpack values and assign variables from objects and arrays. It makes your code cleaner, and it also seems to be preferred when you look at other applications built with these frameworks. So this is a very simple example where basically, let's say we have a user object with a name, email, address, maybe some other fields, and we just want the name and email, and we want to put that into a variable called name and email. So we can just pull that out by using curly braces. Okay, we'll define it with curly braces and say we want to pull the name and email out of the user object. Now, let's say the user object has an address object within it, which has like a city, state, stuff like that, and we want to get just the city and put that into a city variable. In that case, we would use this syntax. So we would say address, which is an object within user, and then city, which is a property of address. Okay, and then we could use name, email, and city as a variable in our code. And again, I'm going to give you some examples of this in each framework. All right, so next is the concept of components and state. Now, when you first learn basic HTML, CSS, JavaScript, you're taught about separation of concerns. You have your HTML markup, your CSS styling, and your JavaScript for any dynamic type functionality. So you basically, in JavaScript, you select elements from the DOM, and you do stuff in sort of a monolithic way. Well, with frameworks, it's a little different in terms of how you think of the mechanics of your application. You want to think of pieces of your user interface as components. So the menu bar, search bar, main content, whatever it may be, you should look at these as encapsulated entities that include both the markup, which is, the display, and the functionality, okay, as well as in some cases even the styling, especially in React. It's all basically wrapped up in that individual component, and each component has its own state, which is usually the data that's associated with it along with just its state of being. So for example, you might have a menu component that has a state of open and a state of close, so that if you click it, maybe it opens up, and if you click it again, it closes. You have that in your state. Let's take an input component in a form, for example. You'll have state, which will be the text that's typed in, and then each time you type something into that input box, it changes that state. You may have a blog post component that holds all of the posts in the state. You also have child components where you can nest and then pass properties down to. So what I want to do is actually take a quick look at Twitter as an example. All right, so this is kind of an intricate interface to describe this, but it's a site that we all know. So basically, instead of thinking of it as an HTML file with separate JavaScript, separate CSS, look at each individual thing as its own entity, as its own component. So for instance, this might be the top bar component with a menu bar component embedded in it, as well as a search bar component. And when we type something in here, it's basically the state of this individual component. Okay, this might be the showcase, this might be the stats component, and then all of these stats is going to be part of the state. Same thing with the tweets. We may have a tweets component that includes all of them, and then loop through the tweets and display each one as a single tweet component. Okay, so that's just how you should start thinking in terms of your UI when you're dealing with frameworks. Now, in a lot of cases, you're going to want to share data or share state. So that's when you look into something like Redux for React or Vuex for Vue for state level management. So you can have this single source of truth, this application state that basically hovers over all of your UI components, and you can send state down directly to them. And there's different ways to do it. You don't have to use like Redux, and in React you have the context API. You can also use something like GraphQL and Apollo so that you can make queries directly from Apollo. So there's different ways to do things, different technologies, but just in a general sense, you should start to think of each piece of UI as an individual entity. All right, so next we have the spread operator, and this is important, especially when dealing with state, like we just talked about, because state is usually immutable, which means it can't be directly changed. What usually happens is you have to make a copy of it and add what you want, change what you want, and then send it down to the application or the component. And the spread operator allows us to do that. So here's a really simple example. So let's say we have this user state that just has one property of name that's equal to John, and we want to add an age to this user state. So what we could do is create a new user state, and we can use the spread operator, which is just 3 dots, and put in user state, and it will basically give us whatever is in this user state. Okay, it'll make a copy of this, and then we can add the age to it, like so. All right, and I'm going to give you some examples of this in React and Redux because it's often used in what's called a reducer. All right, so the last one is high order array functions, and there's a lot of these. These are just some of the common ones. A high order function is basically a function that takes another function as a parameter, but these all have to do with arrays and iterating through them, manipulating data, stuff like that. For each is probably the most basic. It's just used for iteration, kind of like a for loop. It doesn't return anything. It just loops through something and you can do what you want. Map is heavily used in React, and it's actually used to create an array from another array with whatever types of manipulation you want to do. You may have an array of users, and let's say their objects, and there's an age property, and let's say you want to create an array of just their ages. You can do that with map. You also have filter, which will basically filter items out based on a condition. Filter is heavily used in reducers and state management, and I'll give you an example of that in a little bit. So those are my suggestions for what you should learn before you jump into a framework. I think once you really understand those things, you'll be absolutely ready to learn any front-end framework. You'll also be able to pick up a second or third really easily. So what I want to do now is just look at some code examples from each of the 3 frameworks and just show you that a lot of these things are very common to all 3. And if you didn't learn this stuff beforehand, you might think it's actually part of that framework. So you want to be able to distinguish what is just JavaScript and what are some of the concepts of the particular framework. All right, so let's take a look. All right, so now what I want to do is just take a look at some of the things we've been talking about in each of the 3 major frameworks. And my goal isn't to teach this and make you understand how they work, but just to show you that they're present in all frameworks. So it's a good thing to learn this stuff before you jump in. So up here in this React component, we have a bunch of imports. So we're using modules. Basically, we import something from a file. In this case, we're importing the post form component. We can also import from packages like React Redux. And some of these have curly braces, and that means that they're not being exported as default. So there could be multiple things. For instance, this post actions file may have like an add post function that's being exported. So we can kind of bring in as many things as we want, but these we're only going to bring in one thing. Okay, and the class of post, which is our React component, is actually being exported down here as well. Okay, so let's take a look at an Angular example. And this is an Angular component. Again, we're bringing in something from Angular core component on init. And this stuff, of course, is specific to Angular. And then we're bringing in a client service, we're bringing in a model, and then down here we have our component, which is also being exported, so we can use this in other files as well. This is an Angular service, which also is importing a bunch of stuff. It's being exported. And then if we look at the view example, we have a template here. This is just like a new employee form component. Down where we have our JavaScript, we're importing the database from this Firebase init file. We're also exporting this default object. So you can see that modules are present in all of these frameworks. And the problem is, if you're just jumping into Vue after just learning the basics, you might think that this is actually Vue.js right here, or that this is Vue.js, or that this is React, when in reality it's just JavaScript. So it's important to recognize the difference. So the next thing we talked about were classes. Obviously right here you can see we have a post class for our component. React can use classes or functions for components. And classes have methods inside of them, which are just functions. The names of these are actually specific to React: render, component, did mount. So that's stuff you would learn with React. But classes themselves are just JavaScript. Same thing with extending a class. That we're just using this as the parent, which is the component that comes in from React. If we look at Angular, we have a class as well called client's component, and we have methods including a constructor. You can have constructors in React as well, but those examples didn't have any. And then we also have some properties. The colon and then client colon number, this is actually TypeScript, so you would learn that along with Angular. Let's see, this is another Angular example, which is the service, and this is also a class with a constructor and some methods. And if we look at Vue, we don't actually have a class in this component. It's more of just an object that has a methods object, and we have this save employee method. Okay, so the next thing we looked at were promises. And let's see, this example here, which is the service, the Angular service, each of these functions or methods, login and register, we're creating a promise. Okay, so the way that you do that is return new promise. Promises take in a resolve and reject. And whenever you want to send back the data, you want to resolve it. If you have an error, you reject it. And I'm not, again, this isn't to show you exactly how it works, but just to show you we do this stuff in frameworks. Okay, and then when you catch a promise, you use this .then, and you can use .catch to catch any errors. An example of that would be in this view component down here, right here, db.collection.add. So we're just adding something to Firebase here, and it returns a promise. So we do the .then, gives us our data. We're just basically rerouting to another location, and then we have a .catch to catch the error, and we're just console logging it. And you can use a sync await syntax if you want as well, but I don't have an example open for that. Next thing is destructuring. So let's go to the React example. And I know I'm going kind of fast, but I just want to show you guys that these are present. So in this render, we have this .props.post, which has a post property on it and also a loading property. All right, so what we're doing here is we're pulling those two out of this .props.post. So down here where we use posts, which is this right here, if we didn't destructure, we would have to do this .props.post like that, and that's kind of ugly. Same thing with let's see, let's grab that. So we'd have to do it here, we would have to do it here. So you can see that it really cleans things up when you use destructuring. Another area I used it is in this functional component. Now when you have a function component such as this launch item, it takes in props like this. Okay, now the props I actually destructured within the parameter, and it has a launch object with all these properties. And what I did is I just put these into variables so I can use them down here, like launch success, launch date local, mission name. Otherwise I would have to do this, props dot launch dot mission name. I'd have to do that for all of these. So destructuring is definitely saves you on syntax and just makes it cleaner. I don't think I have any destructuring in the Vue app. Let me see. Yeah, I don't think I have anything here, but of course you can use destructuring in Vue as well. Let's see, so we talked about the spread operator, so let's take a look at a Redux example. And if you've never used Redux before, I don't expect you to understand what's going on here, but you notice that we're using the spread operator quite a bit here, because we have our initial state up here, which has post loading, and then, for instance, when we want to get the posts, we want to send some data through a payload to the posts, and we're using the spread operator to copy everything that's in the state, and the state is actually equal to the initial state above. We could have put it right in here, but obviously this is cleaner. So if you didn't learn about the spread operator beforehand, then you would have no clue what's going on here when you learn Redux. Or it doesn't have to be Redux. It could be anything to do with dealing with state. Maybe it's the context API or something like that. Also, down here you can see we're using filter, which is a high order function, which we talked a little bit about. And this is used in delete posts, because what we're doing is we're taking the current state, we're taking the posts, and then we're filtering through and deleting the posts with the ID that's equal to the payload that's sent to it. Okay, you can't see that because it's in the actions file. But what we did is we sent an ID that we want to delete, and we filtered it out and then sent it down to the application. All right, and then if we look at, let's see, I wanted a map example. So let's look at this component, shopping list. So in shopping list, we use destructuring to pull out items from this.props.item, and then we want to map through the items. So we called items.map to basically iterate through these items and then output a list group item with a transition. Okay, now I can't tell you how many people I've met that actually thought map was part of React. Okay, they really did, and that's what I mean. You should learn this stuff beforehand so that you know what is what, and that's the whole point of me showing you this code. It's not to teach you anything. It's not to make you understand how any of this works. In fact, all of this code is from my tutorials and courses, but it's just to show you that so much of this is just JavaScript. It has nothing to do with the framework. There are specific concepts of the framework, but a lot of it is JavaScript, and if you learn that stuff beforehand, then you're going to be fine learning any framework. And even if, let's say, you learn React, and then for some reason React tanks in the industry and Vue.js is now what everyone's using, you'll easily be able to move to Vue because you already know all these concepts. So that's the whole point of doing this. So hopefully this helps you guys out. And obviously you know yourself the best. I'm just giving my suggestion on how to go about this through my own experience. And I do have a course on Udemy called Modern JavaScript from the Beginning, which is a 21-hour course, and we go over every single thing that I talked about in this video, plus a lot more. So if you're interested, I'll put a promo link in the description below. So that's it, guys. Thanks for watching. If you like this, please leave a like, and I'll see you next time. Hey guys, one of the best, if not the best resource I can refer you to for starting a freelance business is at studywebdevelopment.com/freelancing. The creator Kyle shared it with me, and I can personally vouch that this bundle is well worth it. You get a 130-page guide to freelancing, and it comes with things like invoice templates, client proposals, HTML and CSS templates, a portfolio website, access to a private Facebook community, and much more. So use the code BRAD25 to get 25% off today.